Hello, viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the non-signature cards for the Eldar faction that were included within the core set. In this video, I'm only going to be assessing and discussing the card combinations and synergy present within the core set itself, but in later videos I'll be reviewing each and every one of this game's released and upcoming war packs and deluxe expansions. Although this video is going to focus on card analysis primarily from the perspective of an Eldar player, I'll nevertheless touch on any synergy with loyal Dark Eldar and Tau faction cards when appropriate. Although I'm sure to miss some uses for these cards over the course of the video, be sure to mention your personal favorites in the comments below. But with that said, let's get things started and kick off the first of our Eldar army units with the 3-cost Altansar Rangers. It has 2 command icons, an attack value of 2, 2 hit points, and the Scout and Altansar traits. And importantly, it also has the ranged keyword. So, what immediately strikes me about this unit is that it's sufficiently expensive that you're not going to be putting this onto the table entirely mindlessly. It's got extraordinary built-in versatility in that it's not only heavily laden with command icons, but it's also got a reasonable amount of attack power to leverage against a potential opponent during the ranged skirmish round, and beyond all that, it has more than 1 hit point, which makes it all the more durable and resilient up against the likes of Orc Cannon, Cracktooth Hall, or any number of different, incremental, incidental sources of damage. This ranged Eldar army unit bears a striking resemblance to its Dark Eldar brother, the Baleful Mandrake, and although those units are indeed similar, guidance as to which of those two, if not both of them, to include in your deck is probably going to come from exactly where the unique weaknesses of your deck lies. So, if you're lacking during the command phase, the Altansar Rangers with their dual command icons might be the better alternative, but all the same, considering that the Baleful Mandrake is able to one-hit kill, or at least pressure your opponent to use shield cards, on all the more units than the Rangers, depending on exactly what you're looking to accomplish, one or both of these allies is sure to make an incredibly useful addition to your deck. I think it's very important to consider that out of the 93 different army units we've seen in the core set itself, a grand total of 40 of those are able to be sniped by the Rangers, whereas the Mandrake instead is capable of dispatching an enormous 61. So, for that reason, I think it's of the utmost importance that you very much take your local and online metas into consideration when it comes to deck construction, specifically in regard to which of those allies you're interested in employing. Just like the Mandrake, the Rangers are indeed a somewhat steep initial investment, but all the same, as a relatively hard-hitting ranged attacker, they're nevertheless a little bit safer than average from being sniped by the enemy warlord or otherwise harassed, just because you're almost guaranteed that unless they can trigger some sort of action or event against you, that you can get in at least a couple points of potential damage on their warlord, and to increase the likelihood of their warlord eventually being bloodied. Just because, as we'll see a little bit later in this video, the Eldar player is almost unique in being one of the very few factions within the core set that has access to the enormously potent Armorbane keyword that entirely circumvents your opponent's opportunity to shield, and therefore can make for some fantastic opportunities to spring enormously nasty surprises on your opponent. As with any ranged unit, it's a pretty fantastic platform with which to affix attachments, and your options, numerable at present, serve only to ever increase as our card pool continues to grow. So at the moment, you can pick the Banshee Power Sword that gives you a base +1 attack, plus X additional attack for each additional card you're willing to discard, and, seeing as how the Eldar can ally with the Tau, the Ion Rifle is also perfect when placed upon the Altansar Rangers, just because in that case, for 4 resources and 2 cards, you're already leveraging a potential 5 attack value ranged unit against your opponent. So, particularly in that case, the Altansar Rangers can be fantastic when deployed to a planet by their lonesome, in that hopefully, given that they're so heavily stacked with command icons, over the course of maybe a couple different game rounds, even if you're sticking attachments onto them, they could nevertheless pay for themselves and potentially give you some profit, if they can accrue for you all the more additional cards and resources. I think probably the biggest downside about the Altansar Rangers, but then again this same weakness can be said for the Baleful Mandrake and a great many other ranged attackers as well, is that by having 2 hit points, it makes it the perfect target to be destroyed by your opponent's Warp Storm. So it either pressures you to waste events and attachments in the form of shield cards to preserve this and any number of other units, or, considering that this unit costs 3, if your opponent happens to be playing Exterminatus, and you've deployed this unit to anywhere but the first planet, by merit of being able to at the very least break even with you, in that they spend 3 resources on that event, and you've spent 3 resources on this army unit, its value can at times come into question, but considering that in many cases the least value you're going to be looking at getting out of this unit is parity with your opponent, and there's so much inherent upside to a relatively versatile, flexible attacker like this, I see a hell of a lot of upside to the Rangers. I'm definitely excited to actually see them in play once I start to get all the more actual game experience under my belt. So, taken all together, with a relatively durable, ranged skirmish unit like this one, I think it's very hard to go wrong with these Rangers, and at least in the order I've decided to cover these units, the Eldar army is off to a fantastic start, and it serves to get all the better in our next army unit. We have the 1-cost Bealtan Guardians, with 2 command icons, a loyal icon, a single hit point, and a single point for its attack value. It has the warrior, Bealtan, and ally traits, and no game-relevant text. But as if it needs it, because for a single resource, just a single token investment, you get a 2 command icon unit that you can place anywhere on the battlefield that has enormous potential in regard to winning command struggles for you. So even more so than the Altansar Rangers, the rock-bottom, inexpensive affordability of this unit makes it absolutely trivial to play this late in the deployment round, so that you can make sure it's not only reasonably safe from being sitting at the same planet as an enemy unit, but you can almost ensure that those command icons are ultimately going to end up winning you additional cards and resources. And for the cost of no more than a single card and a single resource, it's almost a no-brainer as to how trivial a time these Guardians will have when it comes to making up your return on investment probably the first turn you put them into play, and then hopefully providing nothing but profit during each and every subsequent round that you manage to keep them on the battlefield. They're definitely a much cheaper alternative to the equally fragile, albeit much harder hitting, Dark Eldar Incubus Warrior, should you choose to ally with that faction. But in having such an enormously frail body, it's destroyed without your opponent giving much of a second thought to it. Orc Cannon obliterates this unit if you don't have any other options with which to direct that single point of indirect damage, and Cracktooth Hall makes it all the more likely that your opponent is going to annihilate this unit unless you somehow bolster up its pool of hit points. But considering just how cheap this is, I would prefer to simply run them in mass with the understanding that they're effectively expendable just because you're wanting to probably profit as quickly and as much as possible without channeling all the more cards and resources into these relatively expendable army units. For the same cost as a rogue trader or void pirate, they're much more likely to win you command struggles, although all the same, they don't provide any sort of bonus card or resource for you. Still, alongside your warlord, they are able to contribute at least a little bit during a combat situation. And considering that out of the entire 93 units of the core set, there are only 4 2-cost, 2-command icon units in total, paying but a single resource for that same command value seems absolutely incredible. And considering too that it matches half of those units for HP value, I think that this is absolutely an Eldar staple. It's certainly a shame for the Dark Eldar and Tau that this is a loyal unit, but nevertheless, if you've chosen the Eldar as your preferential faction, I see this being an auto-include 3-copy card for months and years to come. It's strikingly similar, in a sense, to the Tau Recon drone, but with an added point of attack power and that resource token requirement of 1 in lieu of being a limited card. And considering that as the card pool develops, we'll see more and more limited cards, that is almost a certainty to eventually become rather restrictive for not just the Eldar, but each and every faction in the game. So, for every reason I've already covered and so much more, it seems like the Biel-Tan Guardians are very cheap, very flexible, they're fantastic during the command phase, they're not complete slouches during the combat phase, and although your opponent might be able to deploy a Weird Boy Maniac, or simply annihilate these en masse during combat with any area effect units, I think they nevertheless serve a fantastic purpose, and so long as you deploy them as late as possible, I just fail to see any downside to this unit. It's entirely possible that your opponent might direct their warlord to a planet where you happen to deploy a Guardians just to try and snipe off this target, so with that information in mind, it may just allow you to spring some sort of nasty ambush upon your opponent. So certainly, I think there's a lot to admire and appreciate about the Biel-Tan Guardians, and I definitely encourage any and all prospective Eldar players out there to not only give these guys a try, but quite likely to run them often and typically as early as possible. But in any case, up next we have the 2-cost Biel-Tan Warp Spiders, with 1 command icon, a single point for their attack value, 3 hit points, and the Warrior and Biel-Tan traits, as well as reaction. After this unit is declared as an attacker, look at the top 2 cards of any player's deck. You may discard one of those cards. So, for its cost, it does have the same token command icon we've seen on innumerable other units, so at the very least, it might end up netting you some resources and cards during the command phase. It unfortunately doesn't hit any harder than the Biel-Tan Guardians do at 1 single point for its attack value, but it's nevertheless enormously more survivable with that increase to 3 hit points. And for a 2-cost unit, that's relatively respectable in being ever so slightly higher than the curve, and although its attack value isn't high, you nevertheless want to trigger that reaction if you're opting to include this card in your deck, deck as many times as possible, and the more attacks you can get in against opposing enemy units, which hopefully aren't going to destroy you in return, the better. So, important to keep in mind is that the real value of this unit comes from its, at this point, somewhat unexplored reaction, just because with our current card pool, at least inside of the core set, there's not a ton of other cards that complement any kind of milling or searching strategy, depending on which player you're targeting with this effect. So we don't have any powerful deck yet that really focuses on getting your opponent to draw through their entire deck, which result in your ultimately winning the game once they run out of cards. And at that same token, if you opt to target yourself with this ability, we don't necessarily have a lot of recursion-style effects where you could potentially use those discarded cards to fuel your hand or forces on the battlefield. Certainly the Eldar do have at least a few different options at present, but I think it's going to be quite a bit longer into this game's lifespan before we really see any possibility for the Bealtan Warp Spiders to truly either come into their own or become anything approximating a powerhouse unit. I think used on your opponent, this allows you a fantastic ability to look at the top 2 cards of their deck, and based on what you've seen your opponent play, whether it's an event in their discard pile or whether it's one of their army units on the battlefield or that you've destroyed, you can use all of that information to your advantage to determine which of those 2 cards are going to be most advantageous for you to discard. And, on that same token, knowing what you're anticipating to spring upon your opponent in regard to traps and surprises that the Eldar faction is really all about, that too can guide your decision making. So if you see an Indomitable in the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck, if you're going to be using some sort of Armor Bane effect later in the game, maybe it's of the critical importance that you deny your opponent the opportunity to use that powerful event. Or, if you're up against Packmaster Kith, maybe you're just so lucky as to find her Chimera Den, and by merit of discarding that, that could deal a devastating blow to that player's potential. So, perhaps one of the drawbacks of the Warp Spiders here is that they're not nearly as provocative as a card that outright destroys attachments or supports or dominates the battlefield. It's instead simply whittling away at your opponent's deck and depriving them of some of those critical tools that they'll nevertheless need if they seek to absolutely crush or devastate or direct some sort of game-breaking or game-winning combo against you. Even if it seems like you effectively whiff in targeting your opponent's deck, you nevertheless do have all the more information available to you, and if it's something like a cheap army unit that you're getting rid of, maybe you can simply view it as thinking that you're depriving your opponent all the more during the command phase. And seeing as how this character is not loyal, maybe especially if you're opting to include him in a Dark Eldar deck, if you are doing a decent job of choking your opponent of cards and or resources, being able to ensure that they don't draw anything that's going to help them reattain parity or perhaps come ahead is going to make it all the more likely that you can really firmly establish that stranglehold and keep on choking them for the rest of the game. I think it's probably due to the inherent unsexiness of this card that it's probably not likely to be a priority target for your enemy, and so long as you can indeed sneak in as many attacks as possible, this could nevertheless be an excellent tool for you to use against any opponent. And beyond what this unit can potentially do to your opponent, you may instead opt to target yourself, so that if you're really trying to dig through your deck for something of the utmost importance to you, if you can look at the top 2 cards and get rid of one of them, that effectively brings you all the closer to drawing that card that you absolutely need. And if you're using powerful events like Gift of Isha, where you can recur units from your discard pile directly into play, that could be absolutely incredible in helping you to surprise your opponent all the more effectively and to deal all the more devastating blow right when it might make the utmost or perhaps opportune difference. For instance, in that situation, maybe it was entirely possible that your opponent wasn't expecting any tricks from you, since the top card of your discard pile was something relatively inoffensive that they needn't worry about, so maybe they ultimately choose to overextend themselves, and it just so happens that you discard something good, put a Gift of Isha into play, and then return some hard-hitting unit to the battlefield, and perhaps ultimately bloody their warlord. I definitely think that that's probably a corner case unlikely scenario to occur with this unit, but nevertheless, it helps to thin out your deck, it helps to mill your opponent and deprive them of some of their most integral pieces. I don't think the Warp Spiders necessarily need to do a lot of damage, I just think it's of the critical importance that you look at the rest of your deck and determine whether or not the Bealtan Warp Spiders really have a place, just because they're not bringing a lot to the battle in regard to attack value, they're not really even that durable, and certainly if you're just looking for raw command icons, having access to the Eldar, Dark Eldar, and Tau factions, you have an enormous abundance of options with which to use. So, unless you're running a deck very much geared toward the late game, or very much geared to choking, strangling, and depriving your opponent, the Warp Spiders at this point don't necessarily stand that strong by themselves. Certainly, if you are opting to use that reaction on yourself, it combines very well with a few different army units we've yet to cover, like the Swordwind Farseer and Earthcast Technician that they themselves let you search through your deck, so whether or not the Warp Spiders appeals to you is definitely going to vary. At this point, I think they probably fit best into only a select few decks, but certainly as we see more and more expansions, they're yet another devious card effect for the Eldar player to keep their eyes on. And next up, on the topic of command-savvy units, we have the 2-cost Eldar Survivalist, with a single command icon, an attack value of 0, 2 hit points, the Scout and Ally traits, and it confers a bonus card and bonus resource upon winning a command struggle. So, quite clearly, this is twice as expensive as the doubly command-powerful Bealtan Guardians. But it has the benefit of mimicking the Rogue Trader and Void Pirate in that it confers not just cards or resources as a bonus to you, but it allows you to generate an additional one of both if you just so happen to win a command struggle at the planet at which the Survivalist is deployed. I think it's a damn shame, as with any zero attack unit, in that it packs no punch whatsoever, yet nevertheless is forced to attack the opponent, which in a select few cases is actually a detriment. But, at the same time, it does at the very least have more than one hit point, so your opponent's not going to be able to destroy it with the likes of Sicarius's Chosen, or a token 1 damage Tzeentch's Firestorm, or any number of other effects. So for that reason, it's nice in simply having the inherent flexibility that if it's alone at a planet, you need not be quite so worried about your opponent deploying an Orc Cannon and then proceeding to artillery blast this unit into oblivion. That single command icon may not be much, and certainly if you can't play this late during deployment, it's very likely that your opponent's going to be able to contest that planet, and for that reason, whether or not you're interested in springing a trap, the Eldar Survivalist is great alongside your Warlord, just because you can effectively guarantee that you're going to win command struggles, and this unit pays for itself very quickly, in that even a single command struggle win, beyond the resources and cards you'd normally be eligible for, it provides you with the card slot it took in your drawing it in the first place, and it provides you with one of the 2 resources you invested up front in this unit. Again, despite it having an attack value of 0, at the very least, you're not too concerned if it happens to end up getting caught in your warlord's retinue and is commit turn after turn by their side, being exhausted for that initial round of combat, just because if you don't have any potential damage to look forward to, then you're not actually missing out on anything. Plus, if it just so happens that the Survivalist is traveling alongside your Warlord, it makes it all the more likely that it's going to survive for 1 or more rounds, just because it doesn't have the inherent movability and mobility that its identically costed Eldar brethren the Vashia Trailblazer happens to have. So, while it's certainly not devastating in the sense that it's not tremendously likely by itself to win you command struggles, it nevertheless is very potent bait with which to lure out your opponent and their warlord. I think it's a very effective lure in essentially forcing your opponent's hand, just because if they don't respond to this unit, accumulating so many additional cards and resources, particularly if you manage to get more than one of these in play at the same time, could, over the course of the game, be absolutely devastating to your opponent's economy, just because, whether or not you're actively depriving them, you're conferring upon yourself so much potential advantage. But, in any case, even if you opt to run the Survivalist by its lonesome, there's still plenty of different tricks you can use to leverage game conditions in your favor to benefit from those bonuses and the cards and resources you net from command struggles. Namely, promotion is absolutely fantastic affixed to this unit. Hopefully, again, at the very end of deployment, you can bolster his command icon allotment up to 3. Or, if your opponent's matching you point for point in a command icon context, it's entirely possible that you might invest a card and resource in superiority, counting on his being able to replace it strictly so you can not only win that command struggle, but also deny it to your opponent, shifting the economic advantage all the more in your favor, as opposed to strictly sticking to settling for parity. So, taken all together, certainly a little bit steeper of an investment than the Bealtan Guardians, but powerful in its own command right, and, considering the myriad options available to you, ranging from the 2-cost Dark Eldar Incubus Warrior to any number of single command icon Tau allies, you've certainly got an abundance of options available to you, and the Survivalist, for certain, is just one more powerful option for you to consider. But regardless, and up next, on the opposite extreme of the attack value spectrum, we have the Iyanden Wraithguard, a 3-cost army unit with also 1 command icon, a loyal icon, an attack value of 4, 2 hit points, and the drone, spirit, and Iyanden traits. And definitely worth noting is that this army unit is one of 2 cards in the entire core set that has the devastating Armorbane keyword, which means that any attacks from this unit circumvent your opponent's opportunity to play shield cards entirely. So, despite its considerable cost and enormously frail body, this unit nevertheless has the potential of not only hitting enormously hard, but being extraordinarily lethal. Just because even if your opponent had been sitting on a 3 shield icon card, they're entirely unable to derive any benefit whatsoever from that effect upon suffering an attack from this unit. And particularly if you're able to bolster that attack value up and beyond 4, note oh so importantly that this drone is not a vehicle and it's therefore entirely war gear eligible. It's very possible that in a single attack you might be able to absolutely cripple or outright kill their most powerful unit, or, particularly if you manage to put this unit into play as a surprise, bloody or even outright kill their warlord. I mentioned that attachments are fantastic affixed to this body, and seeing as how you're very free, if not strongly encouraged, to ally with the Tau, being able to affix even a single ion rifle to this unit would allow it to attack for a devastating 7, which in a single blow would allow it to bloody or outright kill each and every core set warlord. If you just so happen to be running the Earthcast Technician in your deck, as a drone, it's entirely possible that you can dig through your deck and ultimately retrieve one of these to add to your hand. Or, if you prefer to opt for milling or to simply supplement your Technician, you can also target yourself with the Bealtan Warp Spiders just to try and get these into your discard pile so that hopefully you'll eventually draw a Gift of Isha and then be able to surprise this into play and absolutely obliterate one of the most powerful, important pieces of your opponent's army, even if you don't outright win the game. So, seeing quite clearly just how devastating surprises can be when they involve the Wraith Guard, it might be in your best interest to run the Tau Ambush platform, just because whether or not you can unexpectedly put the Wraith Guard into play, if you already happen to have one at a planet, being able to unexpectedly bolster that attack value up and beyond 4, whether it's 5 plus X with a Banshee Power Sword, or 7, or whatever it happens to be with 1 or more copies of Ion Rifle, if your opponent was counting on you not being able to increase that Armor Bane attack, and then you suddenly can, by merit of your having an ambush platform in play, that could either encourage them to avoid combat with you entirely, or, if they do decide to make some sort of ultimately foolish risk, then you're entirely able to punish them for it. Certainly, though, the downfall of this unit is that paltry 2 hit points, and considering that it's far from free at costing 3 resources, it is susceptible to any number of different effects that your enemy might employ. So if they have a Zarathar's Flamers that they're willing to throw away, or if you're simply running up against a Zarathar running player, any number of different damaging effects are easily able to destroy this unit. Anytime they can leverage Area Effect 2 against you, you're in jeopardy of losing this unit and a tremendous portion of your established, standing armed forces at that planet. But things like Orc Cannon add up very quickly if you've deployed the Wraith Guard off by himself, perhaps hoping that the initiative token will allow you to strike before your opponent can respond. And of course, it should go without saying that almost any ranged attacker in the game, if they have a free window with which to attack, likely has the potential to destroy your Wraith Guard in a single strike. So, certainly for that reason, it's going to be of the paramount importance that you hold on to some shield cards for the Wraith Guard, particularly because the only other source of Armor Bane in the game is Captain Cato Sicarius's Talisarian Tempest Blade. It's unlikely that your opponent's going to be able to confer upon you any non-negatable damage. So, certainly they could employ the likes of multiple rounds worth of Crack Tooth Haul, or Weird Boy Maniac Harassment, whatever it happens to be. The Wraithguard are far from invincible, but hopefully you'll nevertheless be able to leverage them in your favor. And if you just so happen to be playing Eldar, considering that you can effectively exhaust almost any enemy unit on the board, regardless of its location or in most cases fellow army units, that could potentially allow you all the opportunity you need in order to ensure that those potent ranged attackers are exhausted prior to their opportunity to destroy your Wraithguard. Or, if your opponent's holding the initiative token and their warlord is present, then it could also give you one fewer round of having to waste events, attachments, as shield cards so that you can get off some potentially devastating attacks. Plus, maybe your Wraithguard ends up getting to do some combat before it's killed, in which, beyond the effects of that Gift of Isha event, the Wraithguard is nevertheless doing you double duty. So, this is certainly an enormously powerful card. Under anything approximating ideal circumstances, the potential for this ability to outright bloody or even kill your opponent's warlord is staggering, and against any number of enemy army units, even enormously durable enemy flyers, you can nevertheless use this unit to absolutely devastating effect, and certainly, although it's far from cheap, over the course of a game, hopefully if you do end up playing one or more copies of the Wraithguard, they earn their value back in spades. So, taken all together, this seems to be an absolute staple of the Eldar army, one that I would not only strongly encourage you to play, but definitely experiment with and explore just how many nasty, devious tricks with which to use this unit to absolutely devastate and obliterate your enemy. But moving right along and keeping with the fragile Eldar army unit theme, next up we have the Shrouded Harlequin. With a cost of 2, another single command icon, an attack value of 2, a single hit point, the warrior and Harlequin traits, and interrupt. When this unit is destroyed, exhaust a target enemy unit at a planet of your choice. So, it goes without saying that this incredibly frail unit is effectively trivial for your opponent to destroy. Having not but a single hit point makes it enormously vulnerable to myriad opponent card effects, ranging from Warp Storm to Burnaboys to any number of different possibilities. But, all the same, it has a built-in punishment in that whenever this unit does happen to be destroyed, you can pick and choose any enemy unit at any planet on the board and exhaust it immediately. And, oh so important to keep in mind considering this ability, is that depending on when your opponent does happen to destroy this unit, you could potentially exhaust their warlord, or you could exhaust a token, any single unit anywhere on the board, so long as it's not at your enemy's headquarters. So, for that reason, it's entirely possible that if this unit may be destroyed in combat during the first planet, you could opportunistically exhaust a powerful, dangerous enemy unit at a future battle yet to be fought, just to make there one less dangerous threat that you have to face during that round's upcoming battles. Particularly when you combine this effect with Eldorath Starbane, you could potentially go into any number of battles with a significant number of pre-exhausted enemy units. And plus, if it just so happens that you're running hard-hitting but nevertheless relatively vulnerable army units such as the Iyandan Wraithguard I just discussed, or perhaps Starbane's Council, that makes them all the more durable, and in the case of the latter army unit, it ultimately hits all the harder. And even though it doesn't have Armor Bane, being able to swing for an enormous 5 could nevertheless deal a staggering blow to your opponent, at the very least potentially forcing them to discard some of their most valuable cards simply to shield that enormous attack. But even without this unit's ability, it nevertheless does possess a single token command icon, whether it's deployed by its lonesome, or it's simply synergizing the rest of your forces. And, considering its 2 attack value, if it just so happens to find its way into a combat situation, it's likely to pack a bit of a respectable punch in and of itself, just because 2 attack certainly is nothing to scoff at, and at the very least, even if your opponent is shielding against that damage, it maintains all the more pressure on their hand and their standing army. Plus, beyond everything else, I've mentioned Gift of Isha before, and if it just so happens that this is the unit that you're returning to play, not only does it get the opportunity to potentially deal another couple points of damage for you, but as soon as it's destroyed, you again potentially benefit from that same exhausting effect twice. Something definitely worth keeping in mind, though, is that if at any point you opt to sacrifice this unit, for instance, if your opponent plays Power from Pain and this is your least offensive option, always keep in mind that sacrifice and destroy are 2 entirely separate, disparate concepts, and in that case, you would not get the opportunity to trigger that interrupt. Still, all the same, if you're opting to play devious events of your own, certainly this works fantastically well with Doom, in that whether or not you're losing units of your own when that powerful event clears out both players' headquarters of non-unique units, you benefit from not only destroying any potential number of enemy units, but in that case, you get to trigger that ability and pick any enemy unit you'd like, so long as it happens to be at a planet. And plus, if it just so happens that you've got 1 or more copies of this unit in your HQ, even if you're intending on playing Doom, it may actually serve you the added benefit of luring your opponent into a false sense of security, just because they think you're unlikely to throw away so many of your own units in triggering a potentially globally board-clearing type effect like that one. So, definitely an interesting unit. It certainly serves a purpose. I think this is yet another army unit much like the Bealtan Warp Spiders that don't necessarily have a place in each and every deck at this point, but it certainly fills a niche. If you do opt to run this card, it certainly has a number of different clever uses. Certainly, as our card pool continues to grow and we start to see more and more units that need to exhaust in order to trigger some sort of benefit, this interrupt will become all the more powerful in time. So, as is, it's certainly an interesting card. I'm not quite compelled to play the Harlequin yet, but certainly your mileage might vary, and as with so many other units, this one's certainly a bit of a grower, and definitely one that I'll be keeping my eye on. But in any case, next up we have the first of several expensive Eldar units in the 4-cost Silvered Blade Avengers. They too have a command icon, they have 1 attack value, 4 hit points, the warrior trait, and reaction. After this unit is declared as an attacker against a non-warlord unit, exhaust that unit. So, it goes without saying that that is an absolutely enormous expense relative to this unit's attack value. You definitely want this unit attacking as often as possible, but it's certainly not going to be killing any enemy units by itself anytime soon. And by merit of it having just so staggering, such an offensive resource cost, it's nevertheless going to suck up a lot of your available resources, so that if you decide to put one of these into play, you might ultimately experience quite a bit of trouble being able to afford any other army units with which to supplement this rather situational Eldar warrior. At the same time, it's definitely not doing much in regard to helping you during the command phase, although granted it does nevertheless possess at least a single command icon. But in all fairness, that can be said about almost each and every other unit in this game, especially in the range of 4 cost. But where this unit really has a chance to prove its quality is during either a one-on-one situation where you're the player holding the initiative token, or in any kind of battle where there are very few enemy units. Just because even though if it's not doing much damage by itself, it's nevertheless single-handedly each and every combat round potentially effectively negating your opponent's hardest hitting attacker. So, in an ideal situation, you might be running up against something like a Black Legion Helldrake, and so long as you're holding initiative, if you get off even a single attack, you can trigger this reaction. The opposing unit either takes a point of damage or shields it, but in any case, simply by merit of this unit being declared an attacker, you ultimately get to exhaust whatever unit you choose to attack. So in that case, that Black Legion Helldrake has to forego its opportunity to attack, leaving it entirely open to any number of other attackers you happen to have. And even if you don't have any other armed forces on the battlefield, unless your opponent's willing to lose that Helldrake over 8 or more consecutive rounds of combat, then they're essentially forced to retreat, and if your opponent is forced to move units into their HQ, that either sets them up for doom, or maybe they're just committing alongside their warlord in the future and showing up to subsequent battles already exhausted, which, combined with the host of other Eldar exhausting effects, can potentially confer a pretty significant advantage in your favor. The problem, though, is that if you don't have the initiative token, your opponent is effectively guaranteed to get off an attack with their most hard-hitting unit prior to your Avengers having the chance to neutralize it. Particularly if you're not running Eldorath as your chosen warlord, and you don't opt to have him use his exhaustive ability on that unit. So, certainly there are cases where the Silvered Blade Avengers could be absolutely fantastic and spare you a hell of a lot of grief over the course of a combat, but I also think there are going to be a great many situations where their resources would have been better spent elsewhere. And particularly if it's just your opponent's warlord that you're running up against, even with that pool of 4 hit points, it's not that difficult for a warlord to accrue 4 points of damage onto one of your units. And seeing as how it's not going to be delivering many damage tokens in return, this card strikes me as a bit of a high-risk, potentially high-reward unit. It just seems, at the moment, the inherent potential downside really outweighs the benefits. I could certainly see running more of these if they were at a more affordable price, even in the context of having fewer hit points. But given just how this card is printed at present, given how its traits don't provide any valuable synergy, seeing as how this doesn't necessarily combine tremendously well with other card effects, save for the likes of Starbane's Council, it just seems that when it comes to exhausting enemy units, the Eldar have so many other, cheaper, more ideal alternatives. So, at the moment, color me pretty skeptical as to these Avengers. Definitely let me know if your play experiences have proven differently. So, I certainly see the potential, and I definitely understand the utility. I just think that considering that cost, those resource tokens would much likely be better spent in multiple individual units with their own beneficial effects. And unfortunately, at the moment, be it Eldar, Dark Eldar, or Tau, I just can't see the Silvered Blade Avengers making their way into many, if really any, decks anytime soon. But nevertheless, moving right along, up next we have the 3-cost Soaring Falcon, with 2 command icons, an attack value of 1, 5 hit points, and the vehicle trait. It also has the no war gear attachments restriction and the mobile keyword, which, at the beginning of the combat phase, allows it to move to an adjacent planet prior to any enemy opportunity to leverage any number of card effects against it. So, very clearly, in assessing this unit's statistical distribution, its allotment of stats is shifted very heavily towards survivability, and although it only has a paltry 1 attack value, this nevertheless excels during the command phase in that it is enormously survivable. 5 hit points makes it enormously difficult for your opponent to try and destroy through the likes of Orc Cannon or Cracktooth Hall, and, seeing as it has the mobile keyword, if your opponent just so happens to try to force it into a trap, perhaps by deploying or putting into play a Sicarius's Chosen, pinging it for a point of damage and then drawing it in to that unit's planet, at the start of the combat phase, it can nevertheless flee whether or not it was ultimately able to win that command struggle for you. And certainly with an allotment of 2 icons, it's quite likely indeed to end up dominating the command phase. And even though you don't get to benefit from any war gear attachments, this is an absolutely fantastic target for the likes of a promotion in which to potentially enormously frustrate your opponent, in that by being able to shift between planets, you can move to where their command presence is perhaps at its very strongest, and then derive the absolute utmost value from stacking command icons onto one unit. So, if you do so happen to promote this unit, giving it an enormous 4 icons, if your opponent's heavily or overly invested in one planet to ensure that they draw some cards, or gain some ultimately what would prove to be invaluable resources, you could effectively, relatively easily, potentially deny them something that they may have very well worked very hard to try and obtain. For that reason, despite its significant upfront investment, I nevertheless think that this is a unit that's likely to live through multiple rounds, and by being mobile, it's not only able to dodge enemy ambushes, but it's also able to jump between planets into a combat situation if having an additional durable attacker would just so happen to benefit you. For instance, if you are opting to give the Silvered Blade Avengers a try, so long as you can negate your enemy units by exhausting and effectively nullifying whatever their attack value happens to be, having an additional attack to your opponent each and every round is not just another point of damage that they have to deal with, but it's another source of damage. So if you have 2 units, they have to perhaps use 2 shield icons. Or if they have a flyer, it's not just 1 large attack value that gets halved and then rounded up. It's 2 attack values that are cut in half rounded up. So even a single point of attack value, as we've seen on other Eldar units, can nevertheless make a significant difference over time. So, as I'd say with any mobile unit, it's a damn shame that you're not able to affix the normal full range of attachments to this vehicle, just because being able to dart to and fro between planets is so incredibly powerful, but you're nevertheless able to affix at least some useful things to this unit, and as our card pool inevitably expands, as we start to see hardpoint attachments specifically designed to affix to vehicles, this Soaring Falcon, already respectable, serves to get only all the more powerful. So, certainly yet another of the myriad command phase powerful units available to the Eldar player. Definitely worth considering that this is not loyal, and regardless as to how many copies of this card you include in your deck, the earlier you play it, if you get past that initial steep investment, it's certainly likely to make its value back in spades, and its resilience in the face of opposing effects like Tzeentch's Firestorm or Warp Storm is absolutely immense. So, for all the reasons I've said and more, I think the Soaring Falcon is absolutely superb, and it's definitely one of the highlights of the Eldar army. But next, our following unit fills a much more specialized role. It's the unique 3-cost army unit Spirit Seer Arathal, who he himself has 2 command icons, a loyal icon, an attack value of 2, and 3 hit points. He has the Psyker and Samhain traits, as well as reaction. After this unit is declared as an attacker, remove 1 damage from another target unit at this planet. So, particularly noteworthy about this unit is its reaction, in that this is one of scarcely few healing effects in not only the core set, but each and every card we've seen released thus far. It's important to note that you're removing that damage from another target unit, so he himself is not eligible as the recipient of that reaction, and whichever unit does happen to ultimately benefit from that effect has to be sitting at his side at that same planet. Plus, this only happens to occur when he's declared as an attacker, although the developers did throw us the bone that he does not actually have to deal any damage, he simply has to commit and exhaust in order to make an attack. So, in and of itself, healing certainly has obvious benefits of keeping your units alive all the longer, and in his attempting to dish out damage to the enemy, by the merit of him removing damage tokens from your own forces, he can not only keep your characters alive longer to do out even more damage, but he also helps take a little bit of the pressure off of you in helping to ensure that you can keep some of your too-scarce shield cards in hand, and that you hopefully need not expend quite so many just to keep your units alive. Although at that same token, it's probably very important that you do expend some shield cards so that you can benefit from his ability, just because ultimately if some of your units are either utterly devoid of damage tokens, or they're simply destroyed outright, then there's not going to be any kind of target recipient with which to derive any benefit from this reaction. Clearly, it goes without saying that 2 attack is pretty decent, and for a 3-cost unit, that's still not too bad, considering that he's got the built-in flexibility, as with every other unique character in the core set we've seen, of having a respectable pool of hit points and a significant number of command icons. So he is loyal, but he's nevertheless potentially doing double duty for you in his command and combat roles, and if it just so happens that you manage to keep him in play, potentially through the merit of exhausting your opponent's attackers, if you can benefit from his reaction 1 or more times, he could ultimately prove to be pretty valuable. I think the problem starts to crop up, though, when you consider that so many of the Eldar units are so enormously fragile that unless your enemy is striking with very low attack value units indeed, they're either unlikely to survive your attacks, or your opponent has so many attackers that they're likely to chew through your units whether or not you can remove 1 damage each and every combat round. Plus, if you don't have any bigger, badder targets for your opponent to take down, he himself is likely to become a priority target, not only so that you can't benefit from his healing effect any longer, but that if your opponent isn't doing damage to your other units, if they're concentrating all of those attacks on him, and he himself can't heal himself, then they're not suffering any ill effects from allowing you the potential of triggering his reaction. So it's certainly possible that he can help in an attrition-style context, but it nevertheless strikes me as a unit that your opponent can unfortunately work around. Perhaps the biggest, most compelling impetus to include him in your deck is simply because he counts as a unique character and a unique Eldar character on top of that. So he's one of 2 units in the core set that allow you to use Nullify. The powerful Eldar event we'll later cover. That, for the cost of exhausting one of your unique Eldar characters, allows you to cancel the effects of any one enemy event. So, perhaps the Spirit Seer will enable you to cancel the likes of an Indomitable played in response to the hard-hitting Armorbane attack from your Iyanden Wraithguard. But, simply by the merit of him being unique, it strikes me as a bit of a shame that that's perhaps the primary reason for players to want to include 1 or more copies of him in their decks. But certainly, purely from a statistical standpoint, he's no slouch. If you're looking to include as many nasty, devious, and dastardly tricks as possible in your deck, you could also use him to spring the likes of an unexpected No Mercy on your opponent, if you're not so fortunate as to dig and find your Wraithguard. But any time that you're using him to exhaust, for that round of combat, he's not conferring any benefit upon you. Or, for that command struggle, he's not actually lending his command icons to help you. So, it's a damn shame that in that context he's effectively taken out of the fight, but I can't say he's not versatile, and I can't say he's not flexible. It's just potentially a bit of a shame that he has one of the more underwhelming abilities of the different faction-specific, unique, loyal units we see in the core set. Still, all the same, there's plenty of reason to include him in a deck, there's plenty of reason to give him a shot, just whether or not he'll outright blow you away through merit of his flexibility and power ultimately remains to be seen. But even if for no other reason, simply by merit of the different icons printed upon this card, he's likely to see deck inclusion for quite a while to come. But, in any case, moving right along to a unit with strikingly similar statistics, we have the Swordwind Farseer, also with a cost of 3, but with 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, and a pool of 2 hit points. It has the Psyker and Beeltan traits, and a loyal icon. But importantly, and perhaps the impetus to play this card entirely, it has the reaction after this unit enters play, search the top 6 cards of your deck for a card. Add it to your hand and place the remaining cards on the bottom of your deck in any order. So, considering the cost of this unit, it seems a little steep for the body that you get, in that although it's indeed flexible and versatile, it can serve a little bit of a command role with, albeit a single icon. It can also serve a combat role in attacking for 2, and it does have a bit of built-in durability with more than 1 hit point, but the real reason, the real draw and compulsion to play a unit like this non-unique Swordwind Farseer is that reaction, in that it enables you to look at the top 6 cards of your deck for absolutely anything that you would like. Important to note is that you're adding it to your hand, you're not revealing it to your opponent, so that gives you a wealth of information. You get to rearrange those 5 cards you did not choose on the bottom of your deck in any order that you'd like. So, whether you're intending to draw through your entire deck, which, although initially unlikely, does nevertheless become all the more possible the more copies of this unit you run, not only effectively allows you to stack your deck with what would be most useful to you, but it also gives you valuable information regarding what to expect next off of your deck. So if you're oh so unfortunate that you happen to put all of your copies of the Wraith Guard or the Bealtan Guardians at the bottom of your deck, then you know not to count on those popping into your hand during the command phase so that you can unexpectedly deploy them against your opponent. And if it is those Guardians that you know not to count on drawing, then anticipate having fewer cards and fewer resources, so spend money less freely and expend shield cards less freely. Perhaps don't deploy as many events, attachments, or supports as you would otherwise intend to do, strictly because you know you're not going to be able to replace those as quickly as you are hoping to. Plus, I think it's very important to consider that simply by merit of being printed on a card, through playing the Swordwind Farseer, whether you're deploying it in a traditional sense, returning it to play through Gift of Isha, or simply putting it into play through any number of cards that have yet to be spoiled or potentially even designed, any time this unit enters play, although it certainly in and of itself counts as one of those cards composing your deck, it nevertheless replaces itself, providing a little bit of inherent card advantage that so many other cards don't necessarily include. So, despite that seemingly steep upfront expense, you could potentially view this as costing you 0 cards and 3 resources, as opposed to a card in addition to its resource value, as is almost always otherwise the case. And of course, as I've already discussed, it's effectively better than replacing itself in that it not only gives you the option of what to replace it with, but it also gives you the additional information regarding what to expect coming off the top of your deck. And considering that by the time of your playing it, you've at the very least drawn your initial hand of cards and potentially made it through any number of different game rounds where you're drawing at least 2 cards each and every round, 6 cards could be a very significant portion of your deck that you're looking at. So, certainly an interesting unit, very versatile, rather flexible, quite similar to the much less expensive Earthcast Technician, but with a much more potent tutoring style effect affixed to it. So, I definitely think this is worth giving a shot, particularly if you ever need to dig for something in your deck, or if you need your specific linchpin or combo piece to deliver some enormously devastating blow to your opponent, be it their army or economy. The Swordwind Farseer could serve to be a fantastic addition to your deck, and I could certainly see it having a hell of a lot of upside, and potentially provide Eldar players with enormous benefit. Still, moving ever along, next up we have our most expensive and penultimate Eldar army unit in the Wailing Wraithfighter, which clocks in at an enormous cost of 6, but with 2 command icons and a loyal icon. It has an attack value of 3, a pool of 5 hit points, the Vehicle, Spirit, and Elite traits, the No War Gear attachments restriction, and the Flying keyword, meaning that it only takes half damage from non-flying units, as well as the reaction. After this unit is declared an attacker, your opponent must choose and discard 1 card from his hand if able. So, simply by the merit of that enormous pool of hit points and that associated flying keyword, that automatically makes it one of the most durable, albeit most expensive, units in the game. And, despite that enormous upfront expenditure and resource investment, it still hits reasonably hard, although not nearly quite to the heights of enormity that we do see from some similarly costed units in other factions, such as the Space Marines Ultramarines Dreadnought that attacks for 8 at a cost of 6, or, for an identical cost, the Orcish Goffnob, which it itself also swings for 6. Still, all the same, the Wraith Fighter nevertheless benefits from some greater inherent versatility and flexibility than those harder hitting, although often less survivable units happen to possess, in that it does have a rather significant and noteworthy presence inside of the command phase in hoping to generate all the more additional cards and resources for you, which, if you're playing units like this one, you'll either certainly need so that you can afford it in the first place, or perhaps so that you can deploy additional copies, or at least prevent yourself from falling behind in the context of command struggles if you happen to bite the bullet and make a little bit of a risky play in deploying this unit fairly early in any given game. Still, as with so many units, the main reason to run anything happens to be its ability. What makes it unique, what makes it special, what makes it compelling or compulsory to play. And in that case, this reaction makes your opponent's hand effectively slowly disappear round after round, in that each and every time you get to declare an attack, whether or not your opponent can negate that 3 attack value entirely, your opponent has to pick and choose any card from their hand and discard it. So if you're forcing them to remove cards through shielding that 3 attack, if you're also able to stack this reaction on top of that, the longer you can keep this relatively resilient and durable attacker in combat, the longer you can whittle away or potentially entirely deplete your opponent's hand. And if you're running this character along the likes of someone like Eldar Starbane, a Shrouded Harlequin, or God forbid, even 1 or more copies of the Silvered Blade Avengers, if your opponent doesn't have much with which to damage you in the first place, it's all the more likely that you'll be able to trigger this reaction at least once, if not multiple times. And, as I mentioned before, if you can just so happen to force your opponent to retreat, whether they're afraid of suffering overwhelming amounts of damage, or whether they're in danger of risking the linchpin or most integral components of their deck through this unit's reaction, if all of a sudden your opponent is forced to deploy potentially some of their nastiest characters alongside their warlord, only to show up exhausted in wherever he or she happens to be committed during the next round's command phase, you've got all the more targets with which to leverage your debilitating exhaustion effects, and you're able to benefit from having all the more enemy units exhausted. So, it's entirely possible that instead of simply besting your opponent during one battle the following round, maybe you're able to opportunistically deploy forces that ultimately result in your winning multiple battles. Or, through having units exhausted, your opponent fails to win command struggles they were counting on. There are a tremendous number of wonderful detriments that the Wailing Wraithguard can help contribute to, and certainly the more card effects you can have working in your favor to deplete your opponent's hand, army, and economy, the better. And over time, if you can potentially leverage an overwhelming amount of those in your favor, the Wailing Wraith Fighter is just one more card that could potentially allow an Eldar player's host of advantages to continue to snowball out of control, hopefully resulting in your opponent being eventually defeated and potentially feeling entirely outplayed. Definitely worth noting to round out this unit is that although it's war gear ineligible, as with so many other vehicles, by merit of possessing that elite keyword, if your opponent happens to destroy this extraordinarily resilient unit, fall back for a single resource allows you to return it to play at your HQ, only to return to combat, rather survivable yet again, particularly if committed alongside Eldorath to a planet. And all the same, if you just so happen to be playing against a Tau player, that elite trait also confers immunity to the loyal event Deception as well, so that your opponent cannot spend a paltry couple resource tokens in order to bounce this 6-cost unit back to your hand. So, altogether, I think this likely to be late game unit is exceptionally versatile and flexible. Whether or not you ultimately benefit from that rather steep expense whenever you happen to play this unit certainly remains to be seen, but it is itself a powerful tool. But in any case, certainly alongside any number of different exhausting effects and any number of cards that harm your opponent's hand or resource or card economy, the Wraith Fighter could very well be put to a fantastic benefit. And considering just how powerful your late game economy might end up being, a Wraith Fighter or two might be exactly what you need to ultimately whittle away, if not outright obliterate, your opponent. But reining in the enormity of that initial resource expense, next up, our last Eldar army unit is the 4-cost Wild Rider Squadron, possessing a single command icon, as well as an attack value of 3 and a pool of 4 hit points. It too is a vehicle and possesses the Samhain traits. It has the no war gear attachments restriction and combat action. Move this unit to an adjacent planet, limit once per phase. So, quite similar to a mobile unit, for the cost of a combat action, you can shift this unit to an adjacent planet to a maximum of once per phase, where it can either flee from combat or participate in a combat. For the cost, an attack value of 3 is nevertheless rather respectable, and compared to something like the Silvered Blade Avengers, you're definitely paying for a hell of a greater punch. All the same, it's got an identical pool of 4 hit points, which makes it relatively hardy, and despite it being difficult to destroy simply by merit of being able to change location prior to, in the midst, or after any given combat, card effects like Orc Cannon, Cracktooth Hall, Sicarius' Chosen, Warp Storm, all of these are essentially ineffectual when it comes to attempting to clear these off the board in a single, fell, effective swoop. For those reasons specifically, the Wild Rider Squadron is not only enormously survivable, but it's also a hell of an opportunistic attacker in that it can deliver fantastically debilitating, potentially devastating, hit-and-run style blows to your enemy at any opportunity. So, if you've deployed it between 2 other planets, depending on where your opponent's warlord happens to be, as soon as all enemy units are exhausted and it's safe to do so, you can simply use your final battle action window to shift this unit to that planet and get off a single 3-value attack, with your opponent likely having no ability whatsoever to respond outside of triggering some sort of action of their own. So, maybe this allows you to kill some valuable enemy units, maybe it allows you to bloody their warlord, and certainly as we start to see hardpoint attachments released throughout this game's expansion cycles and deluxe expansions, the Wild Rider Squadron serves only to get all the better at doing that which it does. And plus, that opportunistic last-minute shifting into a battle situation not only allows it to get off a sneak attack at the last moment during that final window, but it also puts another enemy for your opponent to contend with at that planet. So you can potentially get off at least 1 additional attack with your Wild Rider Squadron, if you're the player holding the initiative token, which could be in addition to all the other units you possess at that planet. And at the very least, it's yet another body for your opponent to deal with. So maybe you're suddenly able to overwhelm them through numbers if they hadn't been anticipating this unit's moving to that planet and done their math accordingly. You might be able to force a retreat, you might be able to force them to incur losses that they weren't otherwise anticipating, and whether or not you use this in conjunction with it itself, return to play with Gift of Isha, or any other army units, this is yet another devious means at the Eldar player's disposal with which to hatch any number of nasty, dastardly plans against your opponent. Another thing to consider, either in the face of simply losing a battle or in hatching some sort of clever plan, is you could potentially deploy the Wild Rider Squadron to the first planet, and if you're oh so fortunate as to have that initiative token, you could maybe not only force your opponent to overcommit in his or her deployments to that planet, but you could attack as soon as a battle begins, and then trigger the action to move to an adjacent planet, taking a dead enemy unit or a wasted enemy shield card with you, whether or not you ultimately deal damage, let alone outright destroy, any of your enemy's armed forces. Yet another possibility for the Wild Rider Squadron is that if you happen to sweep your opponent's forces, maybe you win a battle, you could use action windows in your favor to move these units to an adjacent planet so that they can take part in yet another combat. So even if they arrive exhausted, maybe at the end of that initial combat round, they ultimately ready and are able to attack your opponent still further, potentially again and again. And on that same token, you could also use this effect to dodge them leaving the first planet with your warlord, to ensure that they not only get as much battle experience as possible by perhaps taking part in battles at the first planet turn after turn, but that they also do so all the while avoiding ever being exhausted alongside your warlord in having been committed directly from your HQ. The possibilities with this character are almost limitless. You could be running up against a Tau player that happens to have a Stingwing swarm with an affixed ion rifle, and seeing as how you get an action window during the combat phase, you could trigger this ability prior to any ranged skirmish round in order to effortlessly dodge what would easily otherwise destroy this nevertheless 4-cost unit. So, for all those different reasons I've covered, despite that no war gear restriction, this nevertheless has incredible potential. As printed, it is enormously powerful, perhaps one of the single-handed most dangerous, flexible, and versatile units in the entire Eldar armed forces. So, definitely mark this one down as one of my personal favorites. I think there's scarcely a single circumstance that happens to come to mind in which you could possibly go wrong with including at least a couple copies of Wild Rider Squadron in your deck. But now that we've covered the full extent of our Eldar armed forces, up next we have our single attachment for this faction in the 1-cost Banshee Power Sword. With a single shield icon, it has the war gear and weapon traits and the text attached to an army unit. Attached unit gets +1 attack value. Interrupt. When attached unit declares an attack against a non-warlord unit, discard X cards from your hand to give attached unit +X attack for that attack. So, very important to consider is that tokens and warlord units are entirely ineligible to receive this attachment, as are so many of our no war gear Eldar vehicles. Although this card does have the flexibility of not being loyal, so it's definitely a possibility for inclusion within a Dark Eldar or Tau deck as well. It does have the initial upfront benefit of conferring a single additional point of attack, which can certainly make a big difference, but certainly the primary appeal of this card is in its interrupt, in that this is one of scarcely few effects in this game that allows any unit to potentially attain any attack value they so choose, so long as you have an effectively infinite or at least adequate number of cards to discard. But the problem with this card, despite its potentially allowing any war gear wielding army unit in the game to outright obliterate any potential attack target, is that potentially enormous cost. For instance, if you were to be attacking a Black Legion Helldrake with an Eldar Survivalist, to absolutely guarantee that it would be able to kill that 8 hit point flyer, you'd have to invest an incredible 22 discarded cards, so that even if your opponent decided to employ a 3 shield value card, you would still kill that opponent outright. And considering what an enormous proportion of your deck that investment is, and albeit that's the most ridiculous situation I could think of, the cost that this interrupt requires could be absolutely absurd. But the potential upside of this unit is that it allows you an inherent flexibility to bolster up your attack on demand to whatever extent you need it to be. So if it just so happens that you find yourself a point or two shy of bloodying or killing an enemy warlord, or from potentially dispatching some critical, invaluable army unit right before it devastates your army. For instance, if you're 3 points of damage shy from killing your opponent's vicious bloodletter right before it triggers its area effect volley and wipes your entire army off the face of the planet, this could, in a pinch, provide a fantastic opportunity for you to devastate an opponent. And particularly if combined with the Tau non-loyal support ambush platform, this could deliver a surprising, entirely unexpected blow and absolutely devastate your opponent, potentially costing them the game. Plus, before I get back to discussing the possible pitfalls of this card, compared to something like a Homunculus Tormentor that in and of itself has an effectively infinite attack value, this is an interrupt that you're triggering, and it's when the attached unit declares an attack. So there's not actually going to be an action window during which your opponent can punish your card discard by using Tzeentch's Firestorm or Archon's Terror or any number of other effects. So whereas they might be able to outright rout or obliterate your Homunculus Tormentor, there's not going to be much, if any, response for any player to resist the Banshee Power Sword, outside of the likes of something like Iron Halo or Indomitable, which hopefully you'll either be able to work around by either luring out in the case of the attachment, or simply by playing Nullify, as is the case for that potentially table flip provoking Space Marines event. Very important to note is that, as with any attachment, this is yet another card that the Earthcast Technician is able to dig through your deck to find for you, and it goes without saying that the Swordwind Farseer is able to do the exact same, although that could be said for each and every card you could possibly choose to include in your deck. It's definitely worth considering that any number of shield cards could absolutely obliterate your wildest hopes and dreams when it comes to the Banshee Power Sword, in that you have to boost up the attached unit upon attack declaration, prior to your opponent having all available information and then making their decision whether or not to shield. Also worth considering is that this only works for a single attack, so unlike the Homunculus Tormentor, whereas it's entirely possible that at the end of each combat round, when that unit readies, it can potentially swing for a devastating amount, time after time after time. Your Banshee Power Sword only confers a one-time attack boost type effect, unless you're willing to keep discarding cards over the course of multiple attacks. And then, at the very least, if you are choosing to stomach that enormous expense, you do not need to exhaust this attachment in order to use it. So, at the very least, you do have the option of using this multiple times per round, but at that point you definitely have to ask yourself, at what cost, and is it at all worth it when you're depriving yourself of so many different potential events or shield cards or army units or any number of other effects. Similarly, it's worth noting that seeing as how it's the unit itself that's being bolstered as opposed to this attachment boosting up its own power, you're unable as a Tau player to use even the odds to abuse this attack boost effect in pumping up the attachment and then moving it between units. So this card, although it does have enormous potential, certainly has some staggering built-in limitations. And although it's put to its utmost best possible use when affixed to a ranged unit, in that it not only confers the obvious Warp Storm immunity that those units are traditionally so susceptible to, but it also quite obviously allows them to deal a devastating attack during that ranged skirmish round. And potentially, if you're holding the initiative token, it would allow you to pick off even the hardiest or attachment enhanced of your enemy's ranged attacking units before they can do anything against you. So, definitely a lot of potential in the Banshee Power Sword, but definitely deceptively expensive despite that printed one resource cost. So, I definitely consider very strongly whether it's ultimately worth it to include this card in your deck, comparing its cost to the far less expensive, often much more effective, non-loyal Tau attachment Ion Rifle. I think most players are going to be very hard-pressed indeed to opt to choose the Power Sword, but as I could say with any card, seeing as how we've yet to see the full extent of our card pool, seeing as how many cards yet to eventually be printed are just the dreams of our developers at the moment, what we eventually do with the Power Sword remains to be seen. So, definitely keep it in the back of your mind whether or not you have any intent of playing it now. So, for the time being, I think we can relegate this one relatively safely to the binder, but as with any individual card, certainly not one to outright dismiss, and definitely not one to forget about. Well, now that we've covered our single Eldar attachment, let's move on to a pair of supports. The first of which is the unique Corsair Trading Port, with a cost of 1, the location trait, and the limited keyword. It has the text interrupt. When you deploy an Eldar unit, exhaust this support to reduce that unit's cost by 1. So, just as we've seen in each and every faction thus far, this is the Eldar version of a very cheap support that allows you a once per turn resource reduction for any Eldar unit you opt to deploy. But all the same advantages and limitations we've mentioned with those other cards are therefore present here as well. Specifically, seeing as how the Eldar don't have any way to ready exhausted supports at the moment, you're effectively limited to triggering this effect only once per turn. It has that built-in limited keyword, which disallows you from playing this card on the same turn as a promotion or Prometheum mine, and as we see all the more limited cards, that will become ever more restrictive over time. although I certainly can't deny that saving resources is, in and of itself, ever a bad thing. By merit of being unique, that definitely calls into question exactly how many copies of this support you want to include in your deck, should you choose to do so. And also worth noting is that the value of this card is going to range considerably depending on whenever you happen to draw it and find yourself with an adequate number of resources to play it. So it's entirely possible that if you happen to draw a lot of events, attachments, or supports, if it just so happens that all the army units you're drawing or choosing to deploy are Dark Eldar or Tau, it's entirely possible that not only might you draw this card on the last or second to last turn of the game, but there might very well come a turn here and there where you have this in play, yet you don't actually manage to benefit from its effect. And considering that this costs you a card and a resource, you don't really start to see any profit until the turn after you've played it. So the first turn it pays for itself, and then that next turn you are gaining one net resource, but you're still down a card. So at that point, any subsequent turn, this all seems effectively upside if you value resources and cards approximately equivalently. But considering still further that the Eldar excel at winning command struggles, the necessity of including a card like this, let alone multiple copies in your deck, which could potentially serve the role of being dead cards in your hand if you happen to draw one, let alone more than one copy of this, it's not necessarily helping you to build a lot of forward momentum, so it will potentially pay off over the course of particularly a longer game, but it's an initial small investment for a potential delayed small reward. So ultimately, this card isn't bad, it's just not terrific. It's not necessarily doing that much for you, either good or bad, so your mileage may certainly vary, and the benefit you'll see from this card is certainly going to vary tremendously from game to game, so whether you opt to include one of these or more is totally up to you. I'm not tremendously impressed, and I think as soon as the Eldar in particular have any more appetitive options, I'm probably going to opt not to include the Corsair trading port once more appealing options do become available. But in any case, up next we have a much more interesting and much more unique support in the Craft World Gate. It also costs 1, but it has a loyal icon. It has the location trait and the text action. Exhaust this support to return a target army unit you control to your hand. So, for a very low, extraordinarily affordable cost, you can put one or more copies of the Craft World Gate into play, and whenever you happen to have an action window, it doesn't matter what phase of the game it happens to be, you can use this support in order to pick a target army unit anywhere on the battlefield, whether it's at a planet or whether it's at your headquarters, and bounce it back to your hand. At the moment, we've yet to see a large number of units that have powerful when this unit enters play type effects, but the Eldar army nevertheless does have access to several. For instance, we've talked about the Swordwind Farseer, where when it enters play, you get to search the top 6 cards of your deck for any card that you'd like and add it to your hand. And similarly, if you're allied with the Tau, the Earthcast Technician makes an extraordinarily affordable ally with which to target with this effect, in that every time that ally enters play, you can search the top 6 cards of your deck for either an attachment or a drone card. So whether you're interested in digging for an ion rifle or Banshee power sword, or maybe you just really want to see one of your copies of the Iyanden Wraith Guard as quickly as possible, the Craft World Gate in conjunction with either of those other characters could potentially facilitate that rather quickly, albeit at what can amount to an eventually steep resource requirement. All the same, if you happen to be allied with the Dark Eldar, the Colosseum fighters make an absolutely fantastic target for this support, in that as soon as you bounce them back to your hand and put them back onto the tabletop, they recur the topmost event from your discard pile to your hand. So whether you want to abuse and punish your opponent through the recursion of Doom, or whether you want to get as much Armor Bane or otherwise simply hard-hitting units onto the tabletop as possible via Gift of Isha, and in that case, the Craft World Gate not only allows you to return units to your hand for subsequent replayment, but to recur events and then to play those again as well. And in the Gift of Isha's case, that serves the additional benefit of returning army units from your discard pile into play. So the Craft World Gate, if for nothing else, opens up the Eldar player to the possibility of a tremendous number of fantastically compelling recursion-type effects, and this support, whatever your opinion happens to be now, only stands to become enormously more powerful over time. For instance, as soon as the Eldar player happens to see something to the effect of Sicarius is chosen, the value inherent to this support is going to increase tremendously. But, beyond the simple recursion of cards, it also has a number of fantastic defensive abilities, in that each and every time an action window happens during the game, that's yet another opportunity for you to pick and choose a friendly army unit to bounce back to your hand. So, if your opponent has the initiative token, or they have ranged attackers, and you're going to have units die with no gain whatsoever derived from them, that would be a potentially fantastic target to simply bounce back to your hand. Just because, under normal circumstances, Gift of Isha on occasion notwithstanding, a unit's going to do you a hell of a lot more good in your hand than it will your discard pile. And being able to play it again, despite having to stomach another investment of resources, is nevertheless always much better to have that option than to simply have it rotting in your discard pile. Similarly, during the early game, if you know that your opponent's going to be using their warlord to kill or simply snipe or harass one of your command icon intensive units, that could be a fantastic opportunity to bounce maybe a one-cost Void Pirate back to your hand, protect the life of a Bealtan Guardian, or, if it just so happens that you've had a unit accrue a lot of damage through the likes of Orc Cannon or any number of other incremental effects, if you're about to lose that unit anyway, returning it to your hand, although if you want to return it to play, you do have to pay the full resource cost yet again, effectively serves the role of healing that unit. And although the majority of Eldar characters are pretty frail, fragile, and squishy, you do nevertheless have access to some rather resilient and durable targets. And particularly considering that this can work on Dark Eldar and Tau units that you happen to have on your side of the battlefield, this could be, potentially, enormously valuable. Even something so simple as having a Fire Warrior Elite sponge up incoming enemy fire, only to be bounced back into your hand right before it's ultimately going to die, could confer upon you a very reasonable benefit. And similarly, in a combat situation, hopefully after some of your units have attacked, once they're exhausted, if you're anticipating some sort of high-risk scenario where they're likely to be killed by an incoming enemy attack, action, or ability, whatever it happens to be, it might be a fantastic bit of insurance, being better safe than sorry, and simply bouncing that grievously wounded unit back to your hand for subsequent redeployment. Particularly something like the Iyanden Wraithguard, once you no longer have shield cards in your hand to count on, it might be much better to redeploy that unit next turn, hopefully win a lot of command struggles, and then supplement that powerful attacker with all the more shield cards that you've drawn during your headquarters and following rounds command phases. So the Craft World Gate doesn't necessarily blow me away now, but if there's any card to keep an eye on, if there's anything that has incredible potential beyond its already respectable power in recurring the Colosseum fighters in particular, I definitely think that the Craft World Gate is an important support to keep continually looking back upon for each and every additional Eldar, Dark Eldar, and Tau unit we end up seeing released. But to round out the Eldar faction's allotment of cards, next up we have 4 different events, the first of which is Doom. With a cost of 4, a single shield icon, the power trait, and the text Deploy action. Destroy each non-unique unit at each player's HQ. So, despite that absolutely monumental cost for this event, it nevertheless has the potential of being absolutely devastating. And if there ever comes a time where you're able to force the opponent to invest heavily into the first planet, only to ultimately send a ton of units back to their headquarters, this card will provide you an incredible opportunity to potentially obliterate the vast majority of your opponent's armed forces. Despite that steep cost, this could nevertheless make its value back many times over, despite having the possibility of destroying some of your own units as collateral damage. Plus, as with so many other events, even if you don't end up playing this for its conventional intended effect, it nevertheless does have the built-in versatility of one shield icon. Very important to consider with this event is that it can only be played during the deploy phase, and if you're running this in your deck, I think there's a large number of different ways that you can try and leverage this card against your opponent. If it just so happens that they end up retreating to their HQ from a big battle, you might be able to opportunistically trigger this event to clear out both players' HQs, save for any unique units. Or, it's entirely possible that you might try and orchestrate some sort of trap for your opponent by effectively luring them to the first planet, where, upon the resolution of that combat, whether your opponent ultimately proves victorious in the end, or they simply opt to retreat, once that first planet leaves play, as it's guaranteed to do each and every round, any units that happen to be at that location are sent to their controller's HQ. And even if your setting up some devious, despicable, and nasty trap involves your setting up yourself to lose units of your own, you could nevertheless potentially easily inflict a mortal wound through the use of Doom, in that if you're able to dispatch potentially the vast majority of your opponent's army, they may have next to nothing left with which to even attempt to leverage against you. I think it's very important to consider that if you're not simply trying to take opportunistic advantage of Doom, but rather you are trying to set and subsequently spring some sort of nasty and devious trap upon your opponent, that you make full use of any of your mobile units and or Wild Rider squadrons in order to deceive your opponent into moving exactly where you'd like them to, whether it's ultimately to feign having a large number of forces accumulated at one location, or whether you're simply trying to bring as much firepower to bear against your opponent at one location as possible, maybe to force a retreat. any way that you can fill your opponent's HQ, and hopefully not your own, with units, Doom could prove to be an invaluable asset to you. The only trouble with this card is that as soon as your opponent realizes that you're playing any deck that contains Eldar cards, let alone an Eldar faction deck itself, they're probably going to be playing around and anticipating seeing this effect. Worth noting is that there are extraordinarily few unique units in the game at this point. Outside of each player's warlord, of course, they've only seen a single unique unit per faction, and they all have loyal icons, so out of your opponent's entire deck, and any units they might have on the battlefield or in their HQ, even though they are entirely immune to the likes of Doom, it's probably not even that likely that they would be in that player's HQ in the first place. They'd probably be much more likely in the deck or hand or deployed anywhere where they can be of some sort of use on the battlefield. It's definitely worth noting that this synergizes to a fantastic extent with Archon's Terror, if it does just so happen that you're allied with Dark Eldar, just because in routing enemy units, you immediately send them packing back to their controller's headquarters, where they're entirely vulnerable to this event. And, although the cost of those two cards combined is indeed pretty expensive, if you're dismantling the linchpin or most valuable, most dangerous unit in their deck, it could definitely be worth it. Picking apart something like the Black Legion Helldrake, or a Leman Russ, or an Ultramarines Dreadnought, so long as you can bounce that to their HQ and then destroy it, that may ultimately be worth the 2-card 6-resource investment in and of itself. And maybe in that case, if it just so happens that any additional units get caught up in the crossfire, that might ultimately just be some additional incidental benefit. Really, the last thing I can think of to mention about Doom is that if you are trying to lure and bait your opponent, the rather fragile and frail Shrouded Harlequins make fantastic units to deploy in large numbers to the first planet, simply because if you do happen to retreat with those, if they're destroyed while in your headquarters, you can nevertheless resolve their abilities, and although each and every one of your units destroyed by this effect incurs additional expense to you, by being able to destroy potentially all the more lured out enemy units, and to pick and choose which of those you subsequently exhaust thanks to your destroyed, effectively sacrificed Shrouded Harlequins, it could potentially not only make a tremendous benefit having played this event, but in that case, Doom in and of itself isn't necessarily alone providing an enormous value, but being able to pick and choose which of your opponent's likely sparse, potentially very scarce remaining units on the tabletop to exhaust could ultimately make it all the more likely that you're going to turn a crushing blow into an all but certain victory. So, certainly a card to consider very carefully as to whether or not you want to include it in your deck, but at the very least, rest assured that by merit of your including any number of Eldar cards in whatever deck it happens to be, your opponent should always have the fear of this potentially devastating card in the back of their mind. But regardless, next up we have the far less expensive 2-cost event in Gift of Isha. It has 2 shield icons, a loyal icon, and the power and blessing traits, and reads Action. Put the topmost Eldar unit from your discard pile into play at a planet. If that unit is still in play at the end of the phase, discard it. So, effectively, this serves to be the Eldar version of the enormously powerful and incredibly frustrating Space Marine Drop Pod Assault. in that for the same cost, this allows you the ability to recur the topmost Eldar-only unit from your discard pile back into play at your planet, at an action speed. So perhaps once your opponent's used up all of their attacks, during that final action window of that combat round, you can spend a couple resources to elicit this potentially devastating effect. So long as you can ensure that the topmost unit in your discard pile is indeed some hardy, powerful, hard-hitting Eldar attacker, by merit of returning them to play, hopefully entirely unexpectedly, you have the potential of leveraging some serious firepower against your enemy. And considering that prime targets for this event are things like the Iyanden Wraithguard, or Starbane's Council from Eldorath's Starbane Signature Squad, or even something like the Wild Rider Squadron or the Wailing Wraith Fighter, whatever it happens to be, you could potentially deal out enormous amounts of damage to your enemy, and then derive the additional benefit of keeping that unit in play until the very end of the phase, or until your opponent is forced to deal with it. So, you're not only effectively likely to gain a free window of attack with this card, but that unit does not go away until your opponent either kills it or simply retreats and then allows the phase to come to an end. So despite that significant expense, you are nevertheless effectively guaranteed to get in at least one attack, and possibly more if you just so happen to be the player holding the initiative token. So, probably in an ideal situation, you did have the initiative token, you are at a planet, and you happen to have an Iyanden Wraithguard sitting there. You get off an attack, X number of combat rounds pass, and when you're finally forced to let that Wraithguard of yours die, regardless as to however many other units you have at that planet, you ultimately return that Wraithguard to play at the most opportunistic of times, and keep attacking again and again as much as you can manage with that attack value 4 plus Armor Bane ability. Particularly when combined with that devastating keyword, the Gift of Isha has enormous potential when it comes to unexpectedly bloodying or outright killing your opponent's warlord, or even if you're just returning some hard-hitting or durable unit to play. By being able to leverage a number of surprise attacks against your opponent, you might be able to kill some of their most expensive units, you might be able to kill multiple softer units, you could do any number of potentially devastating things with this incredibly potent event. It's definitely worth noting that this puts a unit into play, it does not deploy a unit, so if it just so happens that you don't have the ideal candidate at the top of your discard pile, if it just so happens that it's still something like a Swordwind Farseer, not only do you get an additional attacker, an additional body on the tabletop, but you do nevertheless get to trigger that reaction. And as we see more and more when enters play type effects over time, this only stands to get still more powerful as our card pool ever expands. Plus, in that type of when enters play context, it's worth noting that this can be played during any phase, which eventually could indeed become quite important. But, considering in particular that there's no action window during the command phase until all command struggles have been resolved, at the moment that potential there very much remains to be seen. It's certainly worth noting that if it just so happens that your ideal candidate or target for this effect is in your hand and not your discard pile, you could very well opt to trigger the Banshee Power Sword's ability simply to get an additional desirable card in your discard pile, and if it just so happens that your opponent forces you to discard, presuming that you're given a choice, like if they were to use a Wailing Wraith Fighter against you, I think you should pick and choose which unit to put on top of your discard pile very carefully indeed. So, potentially your opponent might kill some of your hardest hitting attackers first, just to make sure that fodder ends up filling your discard pile, but even in that case, if you're not able to derive more than one bonus attack from this event, it can nevertheless confer a pretty enormous advantage. And considering that some of your most ideal targets for this event, like the Wild Riders Squadron for instance, is relatively durable, if you've got a bunch of shield cards, it's entirely possible that whatever unit you bring back to play might ultimately end up surviving through multiple combat rounds. So this is definitely an event to respect, whether you're the player playing this or you're the person running up against it. It's definitely something to look out for, and it's certainly an event for your opponent to be afraid of. If you are trying to squeeze the utmost benefit out of this event, it's entirely possible to bring this back to your hand with the Colosseum Fighters so that you can hopefully return units to play time and time again. Or, in that kind of situation, maybe you're simply opting to be a little bit more comfortable than you'd otherwise be in expending this card simply for its rather respectable shield value. So I definitely cannot see any downside whatsoever in running Gift of Isha in your deck, and I definitely think that this is probably one of the most compelling reasons to choose Eldar as a faction to play in the first place. And next up, yet another event that is extraordinarily unique to the Eldar faction, we have the zero-cost Nullify, with a single shield icon and the power trait, as well as the text Interrupt. When your opponent plays an event card, exhaust a unique Eldar unit to cancel its effects. So, despite the zero printed resource cost, it's nevertheless always worth considering that this has the potentially enormous associated expense with necessitating your exhausting a unique Eldar unit in order to benefit from this interrupt. So, even though the ability to utterly negate and entirely cancel a single event that your opponent opts to play has potentially enormous benefit, you are nevertheless setting yourself up to be potentially endangered. For instance, an exhausted warlord no longer wins command struggles by default, so maybe, despite that zero cost, this does nevertheless cost a card, and it may effectively cost you whatever command struggle you'd have otherwise won. So you're potentially not generating the same additional cards and resources that you would have simply by merit of playing this card. Spirit Seer Erithal is the only unique Eldar unit we currently have access to, outside of our one current warlord, Eldorath Starbane, and if you've got him on the table, although exhausting him and losing those two command icons could potentially be a damn shame during the command phase, it's probably not quite so debilitating as having to exhaust your warlord. Consider, too, that if you do happen to exhaust your warlord, you have to survive a full round of combat before you're given any opportunity whatsoever to retreat from battle during a combat turn. So, despite the obvious upside to this card, you are nevertheless potentially exposing yourself to a large number of various drawbacks and detriments. And, just like your warlord isn't going to be ready to retreat at a moment's notice from combat, you're not going to be able to attack with whatever unique character you chose to exhaust. So Eldorath isn't attacking for 1, and the harder hitting Spirit Seer is not attacking for 2. But I feel like I've very sufficiently covered the downsides. The clear, obvious upside to this event is that you can indeed utterly negate and cancel any single event played by your opponent. So, despite the risk of potentially costing yourself resources, potentially costing yourself cards and actions, this has the enormous upside of potentially saving you from any number of absolutely devastating effects. It could be an untimely drop pod assault that would otherwise have resulted resulted in the bloodying or outright killing of your warlord. It could be an exterminatus that would have destroyed practically your entire army. It could have been canceling an opponent's doom that would have done the same. Or it could have been negating the effects of an opportunistic Archon's terror that your opponent played at just the right moment, potentially removing your hardest-hitting attacking unit from that planet. Just because, even if you had 3 copies of Gift of Isha sitting in your hand, if they suddenly pull your Iandan Wraithguard from that planet, it's not going to be able to die, resurrect, and attack again and again and again for you to benefit from at all in the first place. Definitely worth noting is that this is the only counterspell type effect in the game thus far, and that serves to make it all the more powerful. So, no matter what you happen to be countering, whether it's your opponent's battle cry that would make a table full of 10 Snotlings tokens into 3/1 attackers that would absolutely devastate you, or you're entirely negating a warp storm that would devastate some of your command icon heavy units or army, whatever the effect happens to be, the options are potentially limitless, and the benefit from this card is potentially limitless. So, definitely, if you are opting to include this in your deck, it's going to be of paramount importance that you make absolute certain that you only exhaust any of your unique units at the most safe opportunity to do so, whether that involves Eldrath waiting until the very last moment to exhaust during combat, or whether it simply means that you're striving to avoid Spirit Seer Aerithal from ever joining your warlord's retinue and then committing to a planet already exhausted. The potential inherent to nullify is just enormous. So, I can scarcely say enough about just how powerful this may be. Certainly, it's got a large number of risks and possible pitfalls, but so long as you play smartly and intelligently and always ensure you're attempting to the best of your ability to play around those, this can nevertheless potentially prove to be of devastating effect against any and every opponent. No matter what faction, no matter what warlord you're playing against, Nullify is always going to have its uses, it's always going to be of at least some benefit to you, and in the absolute best of cases, it could turn your opponent's potentially game-deciding move into something that has absolutely no effect upon you whatsoever. And really, the only other thing I can think of to mention is that something that serves to make this event all the better than it already is that you effectively play this in response to your opponent playing an event. So once they've already paid those resources, that's when you ultimately cancel the effects. So, if your opponent's invested 3 resources in an Exterminatus that ultimately accomplishes nothing, negating that powerful effect not only spares an innumerable amount of your army, but it also serves to set back your opponent all the more in a strictly economic sense. And lastly, we have the final card of our Eldar faction and the last of our 4 events in Superiority, with a cost of 1, a single shield icon, and the tactic trait. It has the text Interrupt. When a command struggle at a planet begins, a target army unit at that planet loses all command icons until the end of that command struggle. So, despite a small initial expense on your part, this event allows you to effectively blank the command icon allotment of any target unit, typically an enemy, although at some point it's entirely possible we might see some sort of benefit from negating our own command icons. Still, assuming that you are going to be strictly targeting enemies with this effect by depriving them of those oh-so-valuable command icons, you could shift potentially lost command struggles in your favor, potentially or even likely resulting in you stealing a victory from your opponent, or, in the worst of cases, simply opting to break even and settling for parity. Of all the planets we've seen thus far, they only ever confer a bonus of 2 resources, 2 cards, or 1 resource and 1 card. So even in the absolute worst of situations, you're effectively investing 1 card and 1 resource to establish parity between you and your opponent, in that despite you're not gaining any economic advantage against your opponent, you're nevertheless depriving them of the opportunity to gain economic advantage against you. In that context alone, this card is probably best played when you're already doing better than your opponent. So in that context, if you've already managed to take an economic lead, by playing this event, you might just allow yourself to maintain that all the longer than you otherwise would, in that you're depriving your opponent of any possibility of maybe starting to reestablish some economic foothold against you. So if it just so happens that game conditions are in your favor and you're winning already in an economic sense, the longer you can maintain and benefit from winning conditions, the more likely you ultimately are probably going to be to win the game. But beyond simply settling to break even at this card's perhaps absolute worst, apart from the occasion where your opponent may ultimately still win a command struggle upon your playing this, the most powerful use of superiority is to use it as a means of opportunistically denying your opponent crucial cards and resources. So, as long as you know what to expect based on your opponent's faction and warlord, you might go into the command phase knowing full well that your opponent needs additional resources in order to play any number of nasty different effects against you. So earlier I compared Gift of Isha to Drop Pod Assault. Both of those events cost 2. So, if your opponent only has a single resource, if it just so happens that from looking at the tabletop they're going to be winning a command struggle and gaining that one mandatory resource that would be oh so necessary to play that event against you, if you can opportunistically deny them the opportunity to win that struggle, maybe you're not only maintaining economic parity or your established advantage, but additionally you're making any subsequent combats that following combat phase all the more likely to go in your favor. And this definitely works for any number of different events or army units. If it seems like your opponent is saving up for maybe an Ultramarines Dreadnought or Black Legion Helldrake, if you're even simply afraid of them accumulating a large number of resources to get some sort of big body on the table to oppose you, this could be fantastic in making sure that they go into the next turn's deployment phase with inadequate resources to deploy something like a Goth Knob, or maybe they don't have enough to play Doom. Unless they have surprises of their own during the command phase, all the information you need should be right on the table. You can see exactly how many command icons each and every army unit on the tabletop has, and you can see exactly where the opponent's warlord is and where yours is as well. So for that reason, it makes it absolutely trivial when it comes to pinpointing the exact planet and unit where this single event could make as much difference as possible. Just like with Nullify, the number of nasty tricks and events that you could effectively dodge through this event is pretty astounding, so long as it's played right, and at the very least, if you're preventing your opponent from drawing cards, any upcoming combats might simply go better for you simply because you're giving your opponent fewer tools with which to work. So they'll have fewer shield cards on average in their hand. They're less likely to draw ambush units. They're less likely to benefit from any number of additional card effects just because through this card you're always limiting their options. And considering that you might be allied with Dark Eldar, this is yet another event you might consider bouncing back to your hand via the Colosseum Fighters. And if you're nesting that effect with the Craft World Gate, it's entirely possible that you can use this or any event time and time again to potentially absolutely cripple or decimate your opponent's economy and army. Really, the only other thing I can think of to mention about this event is that seeing as how command struggles are resolved one at a time, it's entirely possible that if you're reeling in a large number of cards yourself, you may win a command struggle at one planet, draw superiority, and then ultimately opt to play it as an interrupt at the next planet in line. So, certainly it's an interesting event. One possible use is simply breaking even, but I think it's so much more powerful if you ensure that you have all the information regarding what kind of events or ambush units your opponent might be playing based on their faction, their warlord, and their chosen ally. So, as with so many different cards, getting as much knowledge as you possibly can is going to be of the absolute paramount importance when it comes to squeezing as much benefit out of superiority as you possibly can. But with the last of our events covered, that brings the Eldar faction review video to a close. So, as always, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Be sure to leave a comment below letting me know which of these different Eldar faction cards is your personal favorite. Which of you had the most luck with, which of you enjoyed the most, which of these has effectively whiffed. What are some gameplay experiences you've had? Be they good, be they bad? I'd love to hear from new and old players alike what your own personal individual opinions are of any of these cards. Certainly, all the opinions in this video that I expressed are only based on my personal experience and research, so be sure to let me know if you have your own opinion. Interacting with viewers like you is the absolute highlight of running this channel, and it's always a delight to get a new comment received notification. So, I'll just say thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you again soon.